Welcome to the FinTech Times Presents series of webinars. Established in 2016, the FinTech Times is a global multimedia news outlet centered around the world's first leading FinTech newspaper. We report on the latest and brightest ideas from around the FinTech world. So thank you very much for joining me. First of all, I'd love to say hello to our online audience. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. I think we've got a really interesting conversation to have here. We'd also love to get your questions that we'll save some time towards the end of the discussion to take. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens where you can submit your questions and we'll go through them as and when we can. If you're joining us from a mobile, then you will actually not have the Q&A function, but you can send us a question through the chat function, which we'll be monitoring. So today we're going to be asking about leveraging digital IDs to combat the fraud economy. We'd really like it if you could follow the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag FinTech Times Fraud Economy, and obviously follow us at the FinTech Times. We've got a great group of people for today's discussion. The panel is going to consider the fraud economy and, as we said, how the digital IDs that have been proposed can actually be used to combat that. So I'm going to ask them to join me all on screen. And what I'm going to start off by asking them to do is give us a short introduction so that we can get to know each of our three panelists a little bit more. We're going to start off, Kevin, if we could start with yourself. Perhaps you could give us a quick introduction of you, your title, and the organization you're representing today.
Of course. Thank you. Hey, everybody. My name is Kevin Lee. I lead the Trust and Safety Architect team at Sift. Sift is a fraud prevention company that helps various businesses protect themselves and their consumers against various forms of fraud, whether it's payment fraud, account takeovers, credential fraud, and also content fraud. Essentially, what I do is consult with a lot of our larger companies around their fraud strategies and mitigation strategies if they are launching a new product or going into a new country, for example. I've been in the fraud space for over 15 years now, and prior to that, led various abuse teams at companies like Google, Facebook, and Square. And so I joke with many colleagues, if it's been bad on the internet, I've probably had to deal with it in some way, shape, or form, whether it's financial related, compliance related, identity related. So pleasure to be here today.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kevin. And then moving just over to David, perhaps give us a little bit of an overview of yourself and your background.
Sure. Well, I'm an author, advisor, and a commentator on digital financial services. I've worked in the identity and payment space for a long time and have written a couple of books and various other reports and things in the space. And I have a number of board and advisory board positions for companies in the identification, authentication, and authorization space. So I'm I'm pretty obsessed with it, to be honest. I'm not sure whether it's healthy or not, but there you go.
There's nothing wrong with a healthy obsession over digital ID, I would say. And last, but of course not least, Lord Holmes, perhaps give us a little bit of an overview and introduction from yourself.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the FinTech Times for this kind invitation, and welcome to everybody out there. Real pleasure to be here. I'm Chris Holmes. I'm a Member of Parliament in the UK in the Upper House, with particular interests in all things 4IR and new technologies. I'm co-chair of the all-party groups on FinTech, 4IR, assistive technology, and have been very interested in the digital ID space as it pertains to all of those areas and the opportunities, economic, social, psychological well-being for citizens and state alike.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, all three of you, for joining us. I was going to come to you, first of all, Kevin, to kind of help us set the scene a little bit. So we've used the term, the fraud economy. Can you explain to us what that means and what sort of areas we're actually looking at when we use that term?
Yeah, of course. And if you don't mind, I'll flash up a quick infographic here to kind of display what I'm talking about. And so when something that I was doing with my team a few months ago is really thinking about, okay, what are all the different ways, let's say we work with a lot of FinTech companies, what are all the different ways that they can be exploited or taken advantage of? And the fraud economy has grown up certainly in the last year over the pandemic, but it's been a long road. And so really three main points came to be. Number one was, of course, there's payment fraud. So you can think of stolen credit cards, money laundering, maybe there's some fraudulent purchases going on. Of course, there's a lot of cryptocurrency, so there might be some cryptocurrency conversion issues as well. But then, of course, you have things like account takeover, where you might have, of course, your banking credentials that have funds in there. But now I challenge folks, if you think about your phone and how many apps you have on your phone, I would say the vast majority of them probably require, or at least have the option of a username and password to log into something. And all those accounts are quite vulnerable and valuable, even if it's not directly linked to a financial instrument. And the last one, and this is harkening back to more of my Facebook days, where if you think about spam and scams, misinformation, fake news, doesn't have necessarily a financial transaction associated with it, but the amount of harm it can do to the online space can be quite toxic as well. I learned that kind of firsthand as going through the presidential elections and whatnot. And the last kind of other two areas to focus on were, one, when we talk to internal teams, or when I was leading my own team within Facebook, there are a ton of siloed teams out there where that can be a challenge to fight this war, to win in this fraud economy. Siloed teams are certainly a challenge, where a lot of these teams don't necessarily talk to each other, certainly as much as fraudsters do. So, for example, my team monitors the dark web and looks at different forums, and we know that fraudsters are quite good at collaborating and sharing. I wish that was the case internally at the companies that I worked at and the companies I work with today. So that can be a challenge. And the last one is around tool proliferation, where if you think about all the tools that are available to a company, then it looks like those tools also don't necessarily talk to each other. And so really, when I look to the middle here for the fraud teams that are fighting this particular war, they're essentially fighting a three-sided war, where you have your external threats, your internal challenges and whatnot that we're really going up against.
Really very sort of interesting that there's such a wide amount of different items that go into that term. And I guess that's kind of why the term fraud economy was sort of created. Just before we move on from that, Kevin, do you find that the situation we're actually in, don't want to use the COVID word straight away, but let's get it out of the room, has the pandemic accelerated that fraud issue, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a few different thoughts there. Number one, the silver lining, let's say, of the pandemic has been it drove a lot of people to digital adoption. So if you were to ask me a year and a half ago, would my parents or would I be doing click and collect or ordering not just, let's say, physical like items off of Amazon, but also food and all these other things? I would say probably not. But we've seen such an acceleration in that regard. So, and that's great in general for consumers. But because a lot of these companies rushed to deliver these services, they weren't necessarily prepared. And so they introduced a lot of cracks that for good folks, and 99+% of people out there are great, they're going to look past, they're not going to try and take advantage of. But there is that sub 1% of the population that is actively trying to cause some sort of discord. And those are the ones that can cause, they're a small but mighty crew where they can cause a disproportionate amount of damage. And that's also kind of crept into the play, where as people move more of their identities online, and we'll talk about identity in a moment, where when I think of my identity online, it's not just a username and password. Like, I trust the internet. There's certain companies I trust as well. And I've elected to give a lot of my personal identity to them. And I look to them to be great stewards of that data. But that trust can be misplaced sometimes, whether it's companies that maybe are doing things they shouldn't be doing with that data, or two, if they get a data breach, or at least in the US, we talk about different utility companies paying ransomware, and all this stuff is because of data leakage. And that's really, when we talk about the fraud economy, I think about the thing that powers this engine. The fuel for that is all these data breaches that have such PII in there. That's really taking a real, unfortunately, getting some real traction and leading to other abuse types.
Very interesting. Coming to sort of David, thinking about what Kevin sort of talked about the forward economy, that there was a nice comment you said at the beginning, which is it's a war. What is the role of a digital ID in that war, in your eyes, David? If you could explain to people that maybe are not as familiar with the concept of digital ID, what does it do? How does it protect?
I'm sure Kevin would agree that it now looks like a bit of a mistake to have built an internet that didn't have some form of identity layer built into it. I mean, at the time, it seemed like a great idea to have everything open and give everybody access to everything. But in practice, the lack of identity has had some pretty serious consequences. But the reason I'm very specific to say that we need digital identity, in fact, this is something Chris and I have talked about before, is we don't want a digitized identity. We don't want to take the old identities that we had before, which were designed for an industrial age, a sort of bureaucratic response to industrial age anonymity, and just start taking passports and driving licenses and making sort of electronic shadows of them and trying to deal with that. What we need to do is rethink where we are and start constructing digital identity for the new era that we're living in. And so I don't mean, when I say digital identity, I don't mean it as a sort of generic catch-all management consulting waffle term to say to Kevin, well, okay, if we had digital identity, that would fix all your problems. I hope it'll help with some of them. But when I say digital identity, I mean something very specific. I mean that new kind of identity that's built for the new world that we're living in now. So what would be the characteristics of that are different from the old world? But I'd like to point to three where I'd hope to provide some optimism to Kevin and to Chris that maybe things will improve in the future. I mean, especially because, as Kevin's point, this is a fraud economy. The people out there that are subverting, these are businesses. It's not kids mucking around in their bedrooms anymore. Those are the good old days when it was just kids stealing credit card numbers to look at porn. Nobody really cared. Oh, I didn't. It's the bank's problem. But these are businesses, and we have to kind of tilt the cost benefit around this. So what would I say? So three characteristics, I'd say, of a digital identity for the new era that's distinct from the digitized identity. One, it's intelligent. Passports and driving licenses are stupid. They don't know who's looking at them. They disclose everything to everybody, and they're indiscriminate about the kind of information that they provide. And everybody knows the canonical example, which is when you're asked to produce your driving license, when you go into a bar in Redwood City and you have to prove that you're, whatever it is, 37 or something now, isn't it? I don't even know. But you have to prove that you're over a certain age. You have to present your driving license, which means you're giving away your name, address, and all sorts of personal information about yourself to the bar. And I think there are 31 states now that have magstripe driving licenses where companies collect all of this data and, ultimately will abuse it. So the first thing is digital identities are smart. They know who's asking and they know what they can tell them. Secondly, digital identities are connected. They can go out and get information. They can do. I mean, we don't need to slip into the sort of technical things here, but I think Kevin would agree that we have a toolkit available to us now that we didn't have a decade ago. We have things like zero knowledge proofs and homomorphic encryption. We have all sorts of ways now of proving things about us in order to obtain the authorizations that we need, proving that we're over 21 or proving that we work for this company or proving that we're allowed to access this file without disclosing any personally identifiable information. So digital identities are more about those credentials, if you like, than they are about the identity itself. They're online. They can go out and get the data that they need in order to achieve whatever it is you want to achieve. And the third thing is they're interactive. And what I mean by that is, if you think of that canonical example again, you're walking in, now you've got a digital identity, not a driving license. You're going to use a digital identity to demonstrate to the barman that you're old enough to come in. Well, how is the barman going to find out whether your digital identity is real or valid, or if the credentials have expired? And the answer is his digital identity. And what you begin to see out of the corner of your eye, you're seeing it in a couple of states now with driver's licenses, this idea that your digital identity doesn't just tell other people things about you, but it validates what other people are telling you. There's a wonderful symmetry in this online decentralized world. It doesn't fit with the hierarchies of the past, where the idea that you walk in with a credit card and the store has to have a POS terminal, and that's the way things work. The idea that everybody could have a digital identity, and that digital identity could make intelligent decisions for them as well as for other people is a pretty different way of thinking about things. So that's a long way round of answering the question. Yes, I think digital identity can help, Kevin, but when I talk about digital identity, I mean something very specific. I mean the digital identity for the new world, not the digitized identities of the old world, so to speak.
Okay, that's really interesting, David. I was just going to quickly come to Chris, because I also want to go back to Kevin, because I can see that you're interested in tackling one of those points. But Chris, obviously, and I'm not saying David's old by this comment, by anything, but obviously David has been around this digital identity and game for quite a while, and it's not necessarily your background. I'm interested to find out when and how you become such a very interested participant in the realm of fraud economy and digital IDs as well, to protect ourselves.
Thank you. And may I say, it barely needs saying, but David is so fabulously eloquent on this subject. Just after his first introduction there, I defy anybody to say that this is boring, fusty, techie, geeky. It's absolutely prescient to almost anything which we would want to consider in our work, play, personal, professional lives. And the thing that first got me very much into this space was my other interest in the new technologies, really. And there's so much chat around 4IR, various other banners, wrappers that are put around this stuff. But to me, I just figured, what are we really talking about here when we talk about AI, machine learning, distributed ledgers, et cetera, et cetera? We're really just talking about the latest tools that we have in our hands. We're in charge of them. They're our tools. They're great tools. They're a heck of a way on from a hammer, but if we're not careful, people may still use them as a hammer and we'll get some unfortunate results. So it's that sense of optimizing for public good and private good all of these new technologies, the new tools that we have in our hands, which, as David correctly identifies, we can do things now that we couldn't do. He said a decade ago, you could almost say it 2 years ago, and it keeps being 2 years ago as we move along. Digital ID, smart digital ID, absolutely critical. And that's what not only got me interested in this space, but truly got me excited about it, because I really almost instantly appreciated just how dumb documents, ID documents currently are, just how much we're missing out on, how much fraud is coming to us, and how much potential we're wasting. Just one tiny example, when I was putting together my report on distributed ledger technology, we saw that at that stage, a couple of years ago, the NHS were using, and I put inverted commas around that, 25,000 doctor days to assure identity. Now, it's obviously critical that we know who that doctor is. We know that she or he has the right credentials to be performing the procedure or the consult they're doing. Pretty critical in medical, as in many other fields. But imagine, through an effective, smart digital ID, 25,000 doctor days being instantly converted into care. But one small example. That's why it's exciting. That's why it matters. That's why it needs all of us to get absolutely into it, get the public debate happening, get the public engagement, and really make sure that we make the right changes, both governmentally, public and private sector, because we've seen what can most delicately be described so far as some perhaps some suboptimal performances.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to come to Kevin, obviously, from the actual fraud point of thing. I think there was a couple of things in what David was saying about the terminology of digital ID, and I'm thinking back to the infographic that you shared. Do you think digital IDs has a role to play in all of the fraud economy, or what's your take on the requirements in different areas? And without making it too big a question, obviously, as Chris was sort of mentioning, you know, there is one area of identity, but there's also lots of other fraud involved in us sharing our personal information these days, isn't there?
Yeah, I think when it comes to digital identity, and I think some great points have already been brought up. What I think about is, and I mentioned this in the chat, where criminals will continue to find a way to exploit others, whether they're organizations. It's one of the oldest professions in the world. However, when it comes to mitigating exposure, if, to what David mentioned earlier, if the internet was built on a premise of everyone has a digital self that is unique, I'd say some privacy folks may argue against it. However, if that's were the case, then in terms of how much damage someone could do, becomes more limited, or the exposure rate goes down, which is great overall. In addition to that, you also, by having a unique ID, it will prevent, I mean, there's a financial aspect of things, but I'd say people online can be mean, and they hide behind the fact that they don't have a real identity online, and they could be anyone and act certain ways that they would not, frankly, act in real life. And if there were that kind of anchor in terms of a digital identity available, then I think not maybe my altruistic side is like people would just be nicer to each other. But if you play that out, that comes down to crime, the way that people interact with each other. Yes, there's still going to be conflict, but I think the way that it's brought up and resolved would be fundamentally different. And then one other point that kind of David brought up in terms of how the fraud economy is evolving. Yeah, it's not the kids in the basement running stolen credit cards to buy porn or whatever. Those days of, yeah, they're still there, but it's minuscule. The exposure is quite low. What is more troubling is you have advanced organizations that have their own objectives and key results, their own KPIs, that are working against either some sophisticated companies out there, but also more less sophisticated companies out there. And so you can, if I go to the highest level, like former companies I've worked with, they battle with nation states or state-sponsored attacks that are very, very sophisticated, and they have a huge bankroll. They have the best engineers, the best data scientists, the best technology out there, and they're scaling that stuff quite quickly. And so the risks in those cases can be quite high. And my main concern is, yeah, I think the Googles and the Facebooks have pretty good engineering teams as well to kind of go kind of hand-to-hand combat here. But the vast majority of companies, certainly that I've talked to and work with, don't necessarily have the same resources as those companies, yet they face the same risks.
That's kind of interesting. And I was going to come to David to sort of comment on that with regards to companies. You know, what support do companies need to be able to process digital IDs and be able to sort of take advantage of these movements forward that we're now able to do?
Well, I mean, I think what industry as a whole needs is some form of standardization. I mean, right now, you know, I can log into some things with my Apple ID, some things with my Google ID, some things with my Facebook. I have no idea what's being given. Well, actually, I know Apple keep most of the stuff secret, and obviously only a madman would log into anything with a Facebook ID. But you get the general point. What we want is the kind of initiatives you see coming through from W3C verifiable credentials implemented industry-wide. And you see Microsoft actually making some very positive steps in that direction. And I think, I mean, maybe I'm looking at this through rose-tinted glasses, given the history of disappointment in this area where no one has so far managed to do anything about it. But in a strange sort of way, I think the pandemic has shifted the arithmetic in a way. and in two ways, which I think will be useful to us in moving forward. So one is, Kevin referred a couple of times, and in his diagram, he made the point, economy, it's business, and if I'd have been talking a year ago or 2 years ago about a digital identity infrastructure, then some boring people in some committee in Parliament would annoy Chris just as much as they'd annoy me by going on about, oh, how much is it going to, what's the cost benefit, and how much is it going to cost over 5 years, and what's the, all this sort of what's the business case? I mean, like, you're the Home Office, you're not a business. Stop talking about business case, but that's a different issue. I don't want to get sidetracked. But the pandemic has shown us quite clearly the cost of not having a digital identity infrastructure. If you look at the UK example, I'm sure the US is just the same, but in the UK, the Treasury's own figures are that something like half of the pandemic support loans will never be repaid. There's something like 30 to 40 billion pounds has just gone down the river because nobody could tell what was a real company, what was a real person, who anybody was, whether they exist. So we now know the bounding costs of not having it. And I think that's very helpful in a way to move forward. The second thing is you see progress being made because needs must, and necessity being the mother of invention, all that sort of thing. You see what people like the Commons Project and others are doing, implementing W3C verify. I mean, I pick on verifiable credentials because I think that's a very fruitful way forward. But you see these kind of things being implemented for vaccine passports and testing certificates and stuff like that. And what that's doing is battle testing the underlying technology and building up the implementation support in different stacks. And I'm reasonably hopeful. I mean, I don't know if Kevin thinks my optimism is misplaced, but I'm reasonably hopeful that some of those technologies, now that we've seen them working and at scale, will get co-opted back into the financial sector, because we really need to move into that mode of operation. When I go to log in, I'll just draw on Kevin's example of social media. That's a very good example, right? I want to go and log into Twitter, okay? Maybe I should only be allowed to log into Twitter if I'm a real person, possibly. I'm not saying whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, but it's certainly an idea. Why is it Twitter's job? I mean, there's none of that. How is Twitter supposed to know whether I'm a real person or not? It's none of that. First of all, who I am is none of Twitter's business in the first place. They're a messaging platform, But suppose I could present the credentials. Suppose I could go and log into Twitter to create an account, and Twitter bounces me to, let's say, my bank, and I log in, using Plaid and all this sort of stuff. And I log in at my bank, and my bank sends back to Twitter a cryptographic token which says, yes, this is a real person and he's over 18. That's it. No personally identifiable information at all. Now, Twitter can perfectly happily create an account on that basis, and I can go away and tweet. And if I misbehave, if I don't ease up on sending my litany of threats to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is a bit of a hobby, to be honest, then Twitter can go to the bank and say, well, who is this jerk? And the bank will tell them it's Dave Birch. So it's not like I can get away with it. The point is that we distribute the bank knows that I'm a real person. It knows who I am. Twitter don't. So let's stop mashing these things up together. Let's start implementing identification, authentication, and authorization properly, and allow businesses to develop to support those different things. Because I want to get to the point where when hackers break into Twitter or Pornhub or Manchester City Football Club or whatever else Twitter hackers are breaking into, they don't get my name and address and social security number and all of my personal details. All they get is a cryptographic token which says 123, and they have absolutely no idea what that means. So I think the pandemic has shown us both the cost side and has bounded on that side, but it's also pushed some of the technologies that we need to move forward perhaps a little quicker than would otherwise have happened. So I don't know, you think I'm being too optimistic, Kevin, but I think there are some positives there.
I was going to say, I'm not what you're going to say anything. I was going to hand straight over to Kevin and see what you thought about that.
Yeah, I I wouldn't work in this business if I wasn't, I wouldn't last in this business if I wasn't optimistic. There's too many things to get jaded over in terms of humanity. But I do think it raises a question of who is the holder of the key. So in David's example, it's the bank. Should that be a private bank? Should it be a government or a nation that holds the keys and then authenticating it? I think this is a really big debate around. It comes down to trust. Who should we trust? I'd say in the US, a lot of people, they don't trust the government. They just don't right now. Maybe it's just a bad PR thing, but I think in general, trust in our government has eroded over the last several years. But I could say the same for social media companies. Trust in my old company, Facebook. When I was there, we would measure it. We call it different things, but it's basically user trust. Like, what is our user trust score today, and measure it month over month. And that certainly is taking a hit. And it goes through a cycle. But where do folks put their trust in terms of their digital identification and who's going to hold those keys? I think is incredibly difficult. And or should it be more decentralized, where we don't put trust in any organization or other people, we use technology in a way that can encrypt this information, and I, as the individual, can choose who I trust and choose exactly who I share information with. And to Dave's earlier driver's license example, there might be 10 pieces of data on there, but I only need or want to share 2 of those pieces with Chris, and that's okay because he only needs 2.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting point, and I think in the US there is a zero trust architecture from the NIST that sort of come about that actually says trust nobody. But I was going to actually, there's a pertinent question that's actually come in from Dan, which I was going to get Chris to sort of react on, which is along the same sort of lines of who takes control and who do we trust. He was actually, Dan was saying that there's many UK government departments and associated departments looking separately into smart data and digital IDs. He's cited examples such as health, UK finance, BEIS, DCMS. Are they all going to come up with all the separate digital ID, and are we going to have more of a problem, or can the government come together and create one central repository, do you think?
There's more than a huge problem, and Dan's question is completely on point and of the moment. I'll come to it shortly. I'll take us a little route to it, picking up on a couple of points that both Dave and Kevin made with the level of fraud which was unnecessarily injected into so many of the government payments in the United Kingdom, be they the C bills, B bills, or the payment to self-employed people. Appalling of itself, increased in appallingness because it was almost entirely avoidable by fintechs having solutions stood up, ready to go, that could have been involved in that, which, let's not go for complete goldenness, but would have at least taken material chunks out of the frauds that we now face. So never mind the question of just how are fintechs affected by fraud. Flip it, fintechs have an extraordinary potential to get stuck into this whole issue, and those solutions are ready to go, but the HMRC were, quote, unable to port them into their system. Now, I'm prepared to give a prize for anybody out there who can come up with the best explanation or a phrase which covers unable to port them into their system. But here's the thing, it's still not all lost, because there are fintechs who have the technology to go into those payments and track back and potentially claw back for the taxpayer, for public good, so much of that money, which doesn't necessarily need to be seen as lost, though it currently is. So to the point in Dan's question, when I think of distributed ID, what I don't think about is this distribution or competition between government departments for various bits of this ID pie. The above the line is that DCMS are doing the private sector bit and GDS are doing the public sector bit, and DOH are doing the stuff around health just because. But the reality is there is still an extraordinary need for leadership from government on this, whether that comes from Cabinet Office, whether it comes from HMRC. It doesn't necessarily matter which department has it, but it's got to be a tighter grip, clearer leadership, and a clearer culture built around this, and an understanding of what we're trying to deliver here. Because again, back to one of Dave's points, at the moment, ID is such a disappointingly papery exercise. Show me your gas bill. Why? Show me a book of pages when you get on a flight. Why? What does that tell us? What does it give in real time? And again, does it give too much? Is it smart? Not a bit of it. That's bad enough. What I believe is even worse is if that approach is simply transferred into digital means, which is a transference. It's not a transformation. And it's just absolutely awful to think that all that same thinking, those same docs, the passport just gets and put into something which is now called a digital ID. What an absolute waste of an opportunity. So in short, the opportunity remains extraordinarily large. I think, Dave, your optimism is right, because we have to remain optimistic, even though sometimes we feel like it is crawling across very uncomfortable ground. But it's beholden on all of us, again, to that earlier point I made, to really get even more fire into this public engagement, this public debate, so people appreciate this stuff matters, and it matters materially right now. If we can get that, I believe we can get close, if not right on point for the right result. But there's some distance to travel right now, no question.
Yeah, I think, David, you wanted to pick up on a point there.
Well, it's just, I mean, Chris and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, because I actually think, so the minister who's sort of responsible for this now, Matt Warman, is actually a pretty decent guy, with a pretty sort of reasonable view of things. And his view, which I agree with, seems to be that we should nudge more towards this kind of framework-based approach, the kind of thing they have in Canada and Australia and New Zealand. So and this touches on Dan's question as well. So the idea is, the idea is not to have an identity that you use with the Inland Revenue and the Department of Health but the idea is to have a framework in which those identities are interoperable, so that I can go and get my HMRC identity using my bank identity, that I can go and get my travel identity using my HMRC identity. So the idea is not to have one identity used everywhere, but to have interoperable identities. And I think actually we might well consider, I mean, whether you would do this through legislation or not, we might well consider an environment where actually we require service providers, retailers and other people, actually to preclude them from using those identities, but to do what they've done in places like Austria and so on, where you require them to use cryptographically derived identities, not the. So in other words, I take my identity into Tesco, and in Tesco it turns into identity A, and when I take the same thing into Sainsbury's, it turns into identity B. So if I want to tell Sainsbury's and Tesco that identity A and identity B are both me, I'm perfectly free to do that. Maybe there's discounts, or I don't know. But the point is, they shouldn't be able to derive that identity A and identity B are the same person behind my back. So having a framework which makes these things interoperable, I think, is preferable and offers more flexibility for the future. I know from the government point of view, because that's how identity used to work when we stopped doing it in 1953, there's a great British temptation to say, can't we just bring back good old ration cards? They were good enough for my grandfather and his father before him. But I think with a modicum of intelligence, this kind of framework-based approach can deliver both the flexibility that we need for new products and services in the future, but also satisfy the more immediate requirements of the different silos that Dan's talking about.
I think that's right. I think the interoperability point is absolutely critical. And I think what Matt, as you say, Matt Woolman's on it, and the approach DCMS are taking is in that space. What we need to be really mindful and watchful of is if there becomes an increasing number of carve-outs, as I mentioned with DOH, and it's seen as it's for everything, but they're different, and they're different, and they're different, and then you get, in the same way, we've been around that track before, for sure.
No, it doesn't work like that in somewhere like Singapore. If the government comes along and says, well, here's the identity, and then the department says, no, we don't fancy that, we're going to use our own. That doesn't happen.
No.
So they have a little bit of an advantage in this kind of thing. But I'm positive about the framework approach. I mean, when I was criticizing it earlier in the year, I was criticizing the fact that a lot of the framework is still a bit empty and a bit TBD. But I wasn't criticizing the idea. I think the idea is right.
I think so. I wanted to take a couple of questions from the audience we've got in here as well, and then leave a little minute for the end for each of you to give us sort of a final thoughts, if we could as well. So I'll give you a bit of breathing space to start thinking about that. A couple of the questions that have come up, I was going to put them to Kevin, if I may. There's one interesting one that says, it says, won't faster payments mean faster fraud? So I think there's a sort of an inkling there that, a lot more of what we're doing online and with the faster payment systems and that sort of stuff, is that actually exacerbating the problem and making it a lot worse?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, it does. And so from a finance standpoint, so let's take Square, for example. It's a payment service provider. It's in the UK, it's in the US and other places as well. If you were to run a credit card present transaction, there's, let's say, 2.75% fee goes to Square. That's the commission. If you were to do card not present transactions, where you, let's say, either key in a number or you go through, or you take an online order, the fees associated with that particular online transaction or card not present transaction are higher. They're not higher because of it costs more money per se to run the transaction. They're higher because of the fraud and security risks. So that's the reason why it's essentially passed on to the merchant in this case. One of the features that made Square initially successful was speed, in terms of speed to enable any small and medium-sized business, let's say, to accept credit card payments. Speed in terms of payments, rather than having to wait a week or a month to get your funds, we'll pay you out in 2 business days. And eventually we started inching to real time, where there's instant transfer, and consumers and merchants, 99+% of them are good. And if you trust them all, and there is some piece of identity or something that we can hang our hats on, absolutely. And, merchants are willing to pay more money to get access to funds more quickly as well. Like, great, it's a win-win-win scenario. The only thing that screws this party all up is that fraud becomes more prevalent. So if there is a breach, instead of accessing one account or having to wait 7 days for a payment, if I can get it instant, yeah, sure, I'll pay a couple of percentage points more to access those funds if I'm a criminal. And so that absolutely, unfortunately, will happen. On the bright side, though, from a technology standpoint, we have the means to be better and to succeed against this, which is why many companies with proper vetting, they do allow instant payout or instant payments. But it's not easy, and not everybody does it right.
Absolutely. There's another question that's coming in the same thing. I mean, obviously we're talking about digital ID at the moment, and it sounds as though there's a lot of work to be done, which I think we're going to come on into our closing up to get a digital ID off the ground. But fraud is happening now. So are there other things that we can do and other things that the businesses should be doing, in your opinion, Kevin?
Yeah, in my opinion, the short answer there is yes as well, where when it comes to other tools, like if we had this crystal digital identity, that's like the panacea, like, yes, we would absolutely want that. In the real world today, though, we are in a bit of a knife fight, right? We have different tools, whether it's machine learning, we have different consortiums where, whether it's we work with governments or work with other banks or other businesses where we can share information and collaborate anonymously in many cases. We don't have the same capabilities as, let's say, a fraudster or criminal just to share blindly like CSV files of PII. However, we do have the tools at our disposal to fight back, and we can work together with our governments, with other companies, with, in some cases there, and I work with plenty of these where I'll work with 2 different companies that are competitors on so many fronts. But when it comes to fraud and this particular piece, we are friends. Like, we are working in this fight together. And those are the relationships, and those are the channels that we're going to need to lean on.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that. And I think, obviously, the problem is this subject, we could go on and on and on and on, and talking to the 3 of you is fantastic, but we're going to have to, unfortunately, wrap it up. There's kind of like, what I was going to do is maybe incorporate a couple of the questions that are still open and ask you in your summing up. So I was going to actually come to you first, Chris. There was a question that came in that says regarding about the reluctance for the public to take up a digital ID. Maybe you could, in your sort of ideas of your hopes and dreams of the future of digital ID, maybe you could touch on that sort of thing a little bit as well.
Certainly, and I think the best example I can think of in terms of how you can make something successful through that engagement is IVF, in vitro fertilization, or what was called at the time test tube babies. Now, you could barely get something more science fiction than making humans in a test tube. Why is that seen as positive in our society now? Why is it not seen as terrifying and the stuff of movies? Largely because of a colleague of mine, Baroness Warnock, who launched the Warnock Commission at the time. Full public engagement, setting out, enabling people to understand and truly engage with it. We need that same approach with digital ID, because what's been made clear, and it's absolutely right in this session, it is a war. It's possible in an instant for any of us, particularly the most vulnerable of us in society, to lose all of our savings, to lose our identity. But alongside all of that, we all need to be conscious that what's going on as well, we could lose our very democracy with the war that we are currently engaged in. I was fortunate enough to be part of the select committee when we did our report on democracy and digital technologies that we launched in the summer of 2020 on many of these very issues. And it is absolutely extraordinary when you get deep into what's going on right now on that subject. So yes, it's financial, yes, it's identity, but the very nature, the very fabric of our democracy, of our society. But as with all this stuff, it's in our hands to make a success of it. And there's a real opportunity for fintech to make a success of this. There's a real opportunity, as Dave set out. Standards are not boring. Standards aren't things which throttle opportunity. If structured right, standards are leading edge, a fabulous sword to have in our armory. Any nation which really gets ahead on this has got a tremendous advantage: economic, social, psychological well-being. That's why I'm excited and interested in digital ID. That's why I believe everybody should be and needs to be.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I can see, David, that you've been having some fun with our audience. There was a question that was, if you ruled the world, what is the first thing you would implement to combat fraud? And David's replied, make everyone use Bitcoin. Do you want to unpack that a little bit for us, David, in your summing up comments?
I mean, at the moment, criminals use cash and you can't trace it. You know, if all criminals used Bitcoin, we'd all be much better off, because you've got companies like Chainalysis and Elliptic who can trace, you know, remember, Bitcoin's not really money. It's not fungible. All Bitcoins are not the same. Bitcoins have a history. And so you can trace and track and monitor Bitcoin in a way that you can't with cash and other things. So if you wanted to cut down on fraud, people giving bungs to corrupt politicians, drug dealing, money laundering, and all this sort of thing. Making people use Bitcoin would be an excellent step forward.
It's a very interesting point, I would say.
This week, the FBI they found that ransomware money and got it back. If it had been cash, it had been long gone.
Absolutely. And maybe Kevin, just to hear your sort of final thoughts on things as well. There was also another question that came in, which was also talking specifically about America, talking about the still prevalent use of screen scraping, which is used as a way to sort of take fraud. Maybe you could touch on that a little bit in the future and where things are going.
Yeah, well, with regards to this screen scraping function, it's my less optimistic answer is that it comes down to money. And when I say that, what I mean is that businesses, whether they're marketing companies or everyone's probably familiar with different bots, like bot attacks. There are good bots out there. There are bad bots out there. Screen scraping can be used for positive things. It can be used for negative things. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going away because there's so much money at stake. Whether, let's say, marketing companies, they want to acquire as much data as possible, scrape from wherever they can get it, compile it, sell it to another company, and there's money there, and so there's incentive. So I don't unfortunately see that going away anytime soon. I know we're coming up on time. My final thought would be, when I think about this particular discussion, which has been great, by the way, the word trust comes to mind. And I think of an old phrase a coach used to tell me was like, trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets. And this day and age, when we talk about identity and talk about interacting online, where you could be anybody practically, trust is it's very hard to earn. And if it's companies that lose trust all the time, it's hard to get it back. Governments lose trust all the time and it's hard to get it back. And things like data breaches where, let's say, my personal information is exposed without my consent, man, it's hard to claw that back.
Yeah, very much so. Unfortunately, we have run over time. I'd love to talk with three of you for another hour or two about this, but I think we're going to have to save that for maybe on Twitter and following up in that way as well. And we can see if we get some more humorous answers from David as well. So I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you to our audience for joining us, and please do continue the conversation using our hashtag FinTech Times Fraud Economy and follow us at the FinTech Times. And finally, just wanted to say both to Chris, Kevin and David, thank all of you for your time and joining us this evening and your valuable insights. Thank you all very much.
Oh, thanks, guys. It was an absolute pleasure chatting to you. See you again soon.
Lovely.
Pleasure. See you all.
Thanks very much. Bye.